Amid the towering peaks of the Majani Mountains lay the small village of Endelia, a place where life was both beautiful and unforgiving. It was a village carved from resilience, where the winds whispered stories of trials faced and victories earned. The mountains that surrounded Endelia were more than just a backdrop. They were a constant reminder of life's challenges. To live here was to endure, to fight, and to grow stronger. For as long as anyone could remember, the mountains had tested the will of those who called Endelia home. In this village lived a young boy named Cato, whose spirit burned brighter than the harshest of storms. Cato was not particularly strong or tall, nor did he possess riches or fine clothes. What set him apart was his unshakable resolve, a quiet strength that would one day move mountains. Cato lived with his mother, Alma, a skilled weaver who created beautiful fabrics to sell at the market. Her hands were weathered from years of work, yet her smile never wavered. She carried the weight of her family with grace, and though the loss of her husband years before had left a hole in her heart, she pressed on. Alma often told Cato, "Do not let the mountains break you, my son. They test you, but they also teach you how to climb higher." Alma's words were etched into Cato's heart. More than anything, Cato dreamed of becoming a scholar. While many of the village children worked the fields or tended livestock, Cato believed that knowledge was his key to a brighter future. He envisioned a life where he could help his mother, bring prosperity to his village, and prove that even a boy from Endelia could achieve greatness. But dreams, especially in a place like Endelia, were not easily realized. The nearest school was a 2-hour walk away, across treacherous hills and rushing rivers. Every morning, Cato would rise before the sun, sling his worn-out books across his back, and begin his arduous journey. His shoes were tattered, his clothes patched, but his determination was unshakable. To Cato, the mountains were not obstacles. They were part of his path. One particular rainy season, the mountains turned unforgiving. Rains flooded the valleys and turned the narrow paths to rivers of mud. The winds howled, and the rivers swelled with water that seemed to roar with anger. The villagers huddled inside their homes, listening to the storm rage outside. They whispered among themselves that no one would dare cross the mountains until the skies cleared. Alma, too, urged her son to wait. "Cato, the rivers are dangerous. The rain is too heavy. You must not go today," she pleaded. But Cato shook his head. "If I do not go today, Mama, then tomorrow will be no different. I must keep walking." Alma looked at her son, her heart torn between fear and pride. She saw in his eyes the same quiet determination that had once defined her late husband. Though she wanted to hold him back, she knew that Cato's dreams were worth every risk. "Be careful, my son," she said, pressing a small piece of bread into his hand. "Remember what I've told you. They test you, but they teach you how to climb higher," Cato repeated with a smile. And so, he set out into the storm. The rain sliced through the morning air like shards of ice, and the path that had once been familiar now looked foreign and menacing. The mud clung to his feet, and the wind pushed against him, as if the very mountains were trying to hold him back. Cato slipped and fell more times than he could count. His hands and knees were scraped and bruised, his clothes soaked through. But he refused to stop. Each time he fell, he picked himself up, wiped the mud from his face, and took another step forward. At last, he reached the swollen river, a place he had crossed countless times before, but which now appeared unrecognizable. The bridge that once connected the two banks had been swept away by the current. The water was a torrent of chaos, roaring like a giant hungry beast. For the first time, doubt crept into Cato's mind. The river was wide and menacing, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. How could he possibly go on? But then, he closed his eyes and remembered his mother's words. "They test you, but they teach you how to climb higher." Taking a deep breath, Cato began gathering stones and branches. His hands were numb, his arms shaking, but he worked tirelessly until he had fashioned a makeshift raft. It was small and fragile, but it was enough. With his heart pounding in his chest, Cato pushed the raft into the river and climbed aboard. The current pulled and twisted the vessel, threatening to tip it over. Cato held on with all his strength, using a long branch to guide himself through the water. The river fought him, but Cato fought back. Inch by inch, he made his way across, his resolve unshaken. At last, he reached the other side. Soaked, shivering, and exhausted, he pulled himself onto the bank and looked back at the river. It had tried to stop him, but it had failed. Cato stood up, his chest heaving, and smiled. The mountains had tested him, but he had learned how to climb higher. The sun was just beginning to rise when Cato reached the school. His teacher, Mr. Baresa, stood at the door, his eyes wide with shock. "Cato, how did you get here?" he exclaimed. "We thought no one would come today." Cato smiled faintly, wiping the mud from his face. "The mountain tested me, sir, but I learned how to climb." Word of Cato's determination spread quickly through the village. The elders, who had once warned him of the dangers, now spoke of him with admiration. "That boy will not be stopped," they whispered. "He carries the spirit of the mountains." From that day on, Cato's journey became a symbol of hope for the people of Endelia. Parents pointed to him as an example, telling their children, "If Cato can face the mountains, so can you." Years passed, and Cato continued his relentless pursuit of knowledge. Each rainy season brought new storms, and each storm brought new challenges. But Cato never faltered. He walked the same path through rain, sun, and wind, his resolve unbreakable. The mountains that had once seemed impossible became familiar companions, their peaks no longer looming with menace, but standing as symbols of his strength. Eventually, Cato's hard work paid off. He earned a scholarship to a prestigious university far beyond the mountains, a dream no one in Endelia had dared to imagine. On the day of his departure, the entire village gathered to see him off. Alma held her son's hands tightly, tears shimmering in her eyes. "You have climbed higher than even the mountains, my son," she said. "Your father would be proud." Cato looked back at the Motivational Mountains one last time. They had been his greatest adversaries, but they had also been his greatest teachers. He realized that it was not the mountains that had changed, it was himself. Years later, Cato returned to Endelia, no longer a boy, but a man. He brought with him new ideas, books, and dreams for his village. In honor of his journey, he built a bridge across the very river that had once tried to stop him, a bridge he named the Path of Perseverance. Children now crossed it daily, with smiles on their faces and hope in their hearts. And when they asked him why he had worked so hard, Cato would say, "Because the mountains do not break you. They show you who you truly are."